I am of the persuasion that it is the relationship that is front and center. It is the relationship that is the healing mechanism. This relationship is the simulacrum of relationships that that individual will be having out in their lives. And so what is necessary is a kind of gentle probing of their behavior right here, right now, little empathic errors and breaches that occur that then need to be corrected or analyzed, in both directions. That's where the real healing occurs.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 215. And this episode is with my friend Dr. Anna Lembke, who is professor and medical director of addiction medicine here at Stanford University School of Medicine. This is Anna's second time on the show. On episode 117, we discussed her latest New York best-selling book, Dopamine Nation. In this episode, Anna was kind enough to be my first guest for a new in-person format that I'm testing out. So forgive me if there's a lot of meta discussion in the episode. But other than that, we talk about her work as a psychiatrist and some of that work's connection to philosophy. Some things we cover include psychiatric phenomenology, eating disorders, the patient-psychiatrist relationship, various therapeutic modalities, moral realism, veganism, the goals of therapy, and the upcoming Dopamine Nation Workbook. I think that these episodes on psychiatry and mental health are not only interesting, but they're important in a way that some other episodes might not be, just because virtually all of us are struggling with some difficulties in our mental lives, myself very much included. And destigmatizing that is a worthwhile endeavor. There are links to Dopamine Nation and the upcoming workbook in the description. It would be awesome if you could like, comment, or subscribe, and especially if you could rate the show on Apple or Spotify. Then there is also a Patreon if you'd like access to an ad-free RSS feed, to show notes, to ask questions for monthly AMAs, and hopefully I'll add some other things going forward. And now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Anna. Thank you again so much for being my guinea pig with this. I feel very professional with my clipboard.
It's like you're moving up in the world.
It feels that way.
Moving up in the podcast world.
I know, like I was saying before, it's completely different doing it in person than it is over Zoom.
It is. For us anyway. I wonder if the audience gets also a different feel of a more embodied experience.
I think they do, because I know that the episodes on video do much better than the ones that are on Zoom.
Oh, when you say on video, you mean when the person's in person?
Yeah, when we're in person and there are camera shifts, and the dynamics are completely different. Because, I don't know, I mean, you've done tons of podcasts over Zoom, and one of the things that you said right after ours, and this led to us hanging out actually in person quite a bit, is that you find podcasts are like speed dating. And
right.
And like you have a short period of time together, and you either have chemistry or you don't.
Right.
But one of the big things that I've noticed when doing podcasts over Zoom is it's very problematic to interrupt people.
Yes.
Just because there's a lag, and there's also a disconnect in that you're not as sensitive to somebody's body language.
That's right.
As you would be.
They're not able to see the physical cues of when you're getting ready to interrupt them or when you want to say something. Much of that is lost, or it has to be really exaggerated on Zoom for them to get it.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually, so I just started. I did my first one a few days ago, and it's coming out on Wednesday. AMA episodes,
What is AMA episodes?
AMA is Ask Me Anything.
Oh, you have AMA episodes?
I'm going to start doing one every month.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and
That's where your audience asks you things?
yes, where my audience asks me things.
But that's not in person, right?
No, it's not in person, but what I was going to say is that one of the questions was asking how my podcasting style has changed over the last 2 years. And the person who asked this question noticed that I never interrupt my guests, or very seldom interrupt my guests. One reason is that I got a comment very early on that told me I was interrupting a lot and to stop doing it. And then I watched that episode and I was interrupting too much. But as I just said, it totally skews the dynamic if I start interrupting people. But another person was complaining that I don't talk enough in episodes. And I think that now, as we're already seeing, I'm talking a lot more than I usually do.
To me, you've got sort of like, did you invite a talking head and you're kind of just creating a platform for them? Or are you actually having a dialogue? I think both can be good. But for me personally, I like the dialogue. So I kind of like, interruptions actually. And I like it when it's more sort of organic and meandering, but that's me. Maybe that's not for everybody.
I wanted to ask though, and you mentioned that after this you have a session over Zoom.
Right.
How you feel that as a psychiatrist in Zoom versus in-person appointments or sessions. What do you call yours? Sessions or appointments?
Telehealth is the kind of the standard
But even
term.
in person?
What in person is just a session, or an appointment. I mean, we use the medical model in psychiatry. I'm an MD, medical model. So these are appointments that we have with patients rather than sessions, which is more kind of psychotherapy speak. We also refer to our patients as patients rather than clients, which in the psychology, psychotherapy world, people will talk about having clients, even including doctoral PhD and PsyD therapists will talk about having clients, which is kind of weird because to me, that sounds a little bit more like a business model, which of course, it is partially a business, but we don't use that language. We use the patient language, medical model.
Well, I want to get back to the medical model at some point, actually. But first, I was wondering...
By the way, is this part of it now? Just out of curiosity?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
I just wasn't wondering.
Yeah. This is...
Are we doing it right now?
I know. It's very different than over Zoom. I mean, I noticed that I record over Riverside, which you've used. And when you press record, there's like a 3, 2, 1 countdown.
Sure.
And as soon as you press that button, everybody sees it, and I can just sense a lot of the guests just tense up.
Oh, of course. Or get more performative in some way. I mean...
But this has the soft beginning.
Yes. Although the tricky part about that is then your guest doesn't quite know, well, are we off the record? Are we on the record? But I suppose from the moment you clapped your hands, everything was on the record. Unless I say it's off, off the record.
But as I always say, I can cut anything out if my guest wants me to. But returning to the telehealth versus in-person visits, I'm wondering if you think that there's a real substantive difference between the therapy, or I don't know if you want to call it the therapeutic process, the session, between the two media.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so much lost when you're not seeing a patient in person. There's obviously all the body language, but I mean, I think there's probably pheromones, chemical stuff you can call that woo-woo, but I think it's really real. There's this sense of like embodying a shared sacred space in which intimacies are exchanged. It has, a little bit more, this is all in person I'm talking about, a little bit more of like a sacred quality. The space itself is invested with a sort of specialness in the encounter, which is all really important to that process of healing, because so much of healing in psychotherapy really is the relationship, right? And the uniqueness of the relationship, and that although my patient and I are not friends, right? the connection is real. It has to be emotional and real. I have to genuinely care for them. They have to genuinely trust me. But the frame is unique in that it is acknowledged a priori that I am there to help. They are there to be helped. I have to come with my emotional, sexual, physical needs all met. So I'm not trying to get them met by the patient, and the patient can feel that they're coming into a safe space where they are there to be, attended to and healed. So all of that is really important, and it's so much easier to embody that and feel it on like a deeper intuitive level when you're in person. Now, I think that the telehealth or Zoom visit, which is, by the way, becoming more and more the norm, is better than no visit at all, but not as good as in person, just to broadly summarize. I, for one, am really happy that I am not starting my career now, because it looks like more and more of psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, mental health is going to occur in this telehealth space, online and not in person. And I just think not only are patients/clients missing out, but also providers are, because it's so much more fun to sit with patients in person. And during COVID, of course, everything went online overnight. Since all of that is pretty much over, I would say about 40% of our patients have come back to in person. And I'm so excited to see a real live human in clinic now. I'm like, oh my gosh, they came in person. I can't wait, because of all of the sort of barriers from the Zoom or online experience.
Yeah, this already feels, I did a few in-person episodes right when I started the podcast, but it's been 2 years. And this already feels so different because...
Different good, different bad?
Definitely different good.
Okay. Yeah.
We had... So I don't know how many times we've gotten lunch in person at the wonderful medical school restaurant cafe, but it's very different from the first episode where when the other person is talking, there's just this pressure to disengage because I've got a cat jumping all over me, and there are other things going on the computer screens.
Yeah. Well, what it feels like when you're doing these interviews on Zoom is that you're talking to someone through a very long tunnel, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're in your space, they're in their space. Their space is, created by their persona, but also, as you say, what's in the background, your cat moving around. Also, people just look different in 2 dimensions. Like, you don't actually know how tall or short. People are always shocked at how tall I am when they meet me in person, right? Tall. So, all these sort of funny little things. Yeah, and it's hard to know because I know you better now, so it's hard to know if because we're more relaxed with each other because we know each other now, or is it because is that part of it, or is it also that we're in person? But you have a restrained quality when you're doing your Zoom podcast. It's an energetic but restrained, like kind of on the balls of your feet quality, but very restrained. And then you've got your cat coming through to kind of relax you and your audience members periodically, which is very nice. And then you have some weird art in the background that, I don't know what it means. Stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something that you said earlier is you mentioned, I think, that you do psychotherapy, which is different from, but an offshoot of psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. And in psychoanalysis, the relationship between analyst and analysand is front and center, and transference is the operative word in that domain. But I'm wondering how front and center it is for psychotherapy or psychodynamic psychotherapy when it's taught and when it's practiced, because I don't think that when a patient just goes into therapy, they're thinking, let's focus on this relationship that we're creating. Right. They're focused on how are we going to solve my problems. But my own therapist refers to the therapeutic process as a corrective emotional experience that is mediated by the relationship between analyst and analysand.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, I can't speak for everybody. I can really only speak for myself and my own, 25 plus years of practice. I would call myself an eclectic therapist, meaning that I incorporate many different tools and models. And psychotherapy itself has evolved and changed over time, including psychoanalysis. But certainly, I am of the persuasion that it is the relationship that is front and center. It is the relationship that is the healing mechanism. This relationship is the simulacrum of relationships that that individual will be having out in their lives. And so what is necessary is a kind of gentle probing of their behavior right here, right now, little empathic errors and breaches that occur that then need to be corrected or analyzed, in both directions. That's where the real healing occurs. It's that human connection.
And in a session or throughout a relationship, do you find yourself pointing out these empathic errors that need correction, or are you waiting for the patient to come upon it themselves?
Oh, so typically I would have to point it out. And this is where art meets science, because you have to use a lot of intuition, judgment, and experience to know when the patient is ready to hear it, because it can often be alarming and potentially injuring for them. So just to give you an example, the other day I was seeing a patient who is describing as a primary problem his feeling of disconnection with other people and an inability to know how to make connection. And one of the things that I noticed as, in our work together, and by the way, now we're talking like we're into like the 10th session or so, right? So this is not in the first visit or even the second or the fifth, where we've established rapport, there's trust. But I noticed that, and by the way, it's on Zoom, so just FYI, that, of course, when he's talking, I am fully present, right? I'm not checking my email. I don't have my smartphone there. I'm in a quiet space. It's my job to be fully present for him. My being present with all of my being is, the morally right thing to do and also the healing mechanism. That's my firm belief. But I noticed that and so I am present in that way and quiet when he's talking. But I noticed that whenever I would talk, at first he would seem to listen, but within seconds, it was like his eyes would flick to reading something that came in on his screen or sort of looking to the side. In other words, at least the appearance of him being disengaged and distracted. Very engaged when he was talking, disengaged when I was talking. And so I observed this over multiple sessions. I reflected on it. And then one day it just came to me, this would be helpful for me to point out to him. So I said, I'm going to give you some feedback that might be a little bit difficult to hear, but I think it might be instructive for you, something to reflect on. And I just said what I just told you, right? That I noticed that when I'm talking, even if I'm talking for very short periods of time, because most of what I'm doing is listening, I noticed that you seem very quickly distracted. And I'm not sure you're aware of that. And maybe you're not actually distracted. So anyway, that then opens the door. And to his credit, so sometimes that can be like a narcissistic injury. And even if it is, it's grist for the mill, right? Then we can work on that. But it wasn't. He was able to take it in and he was thoughtful about it. And the next session he came back, I thought a lot about what you said. Now that's gold, right? So it penetrated. He had an emotional reaction. He was thinking about it. And then he could reflect on it. We could pursue it some more. So that kind of gentle probing, getting at what might be, in his case, like kind of a narcissistic defense, not wanting to be fully present and fully engaged. And so defending against that by essentially disengaging or dissociating when other people are talking, which might be a contributor to why he's not able to connect, things like that.
Before I respond to that, I have a sort of meta question about the conversation. I just jotted down a couple of words that you said. You noticed, and I'm wondering, how does that feel? How does that feel on the opposite side of the in-person interaction?
Yeah. You want me to be totally honest here?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I think I thought of that example because in some ways you have a sort of some similar characteristics. I'm sorry, is this too much?
No.
Okay, so I mean, in some ways you're a really good listener, but there's a way in which I'll feel like I can almost see you listening at the same time that another tape is playing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious about that. And so the writing is part of a reinforcement. Of course, you've got a double job here, and you're also not my patient, right? You're doing an interview, so you're trying to track what's being said. Is this coherent? Where are we going next? But even sometimes, when we've had lunch and such together, I can just sense there's so much going on up there that it's hard for you sometimes just to be like, I can just show up for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
No, that's totally fair. I was also wondering though if it's disarming and throws you off what you're doing if I'm writing while you're talking.
No, not really.
Okay, cool. No,
Yeah,
that was helpful for me. I get that a lot, that it's hard to tell what I'm thinking.
Right. Well, there's a sort of foreground and then there's a sort of background, and the background seems more active than the foreground, I think is, yeah.
Well, what I was thinking, or what I latched on to that you were saying was, or there were two things that kind of connected. One, it's your job as the therapist to be correcting empathic errors and pointing things out, and then
maybe exploring empathic errors,
exploring empathic, but
especially
you still have
my own, especially when I don't rise to the occasion for that person.
But you're in this position of identifying them, and then it's also presumed that you're the authority in the situation. And another thing you said is, I don't recall.
Can I challenge that? Because
Yes.
I mean, I don't think that presumption is correct.
Okay.
Like, one of I've had so many wonderful teachers over the years, and one of them said, we're not mind readers. And in fact, some of our worst errors are when we assume that we are mind readers and that we know what's going on in somebody else's head, which for me can happen when I over-identify with somebody's experience. Like, I've had a similar experience myself, so I think I know what they're feeling in a given, and I've learned through errors over the years to really not pretend that I am a mind reader, and to really just try to understand that person's subjective experience without feeling like I'm the authority, either in terms of knowing what they're thinking and feeling or in terms of interpretation.
But I still think that within the dynamic, you are an authority in at least some sense, and that they're coming to see you, they're paying you. That's a very important part of the psychodynamic relationship. But what I was getting at was, you also said that something was morally right. It was the morally right thing to do. And this, getting into some philosophical territory, sort of presupposes maybe that there is a such thing as moral rightness or moral correctness, or more broadly, moral facts.
Right.
And this was something I wanted to talk about with regard to your therapy, your therapeutic process. If you have a patient, for instance, that seems quite happy maybe at the end of your therapy, but they have what would be considered conventionally very morally wrong attitudes, would you feel that the therapeutic process has been complete? Like, let's say if they have all sorts of pedophilic or necrophiliac fantasies, this sort of thing, but otherwise they have healthy relationships, they're functioning in their job, perhaps maybe I should just leave it at that and see what you think at this point.
Yeah, I mean, let me go back and say, when I said that I felt it was my moral responsibility to feel fully present, I think that's probably, if I had to sort of universally describe my moral system, that it begins with, Martin Buber's I and thou moment, that it is the relationship that we have with other people in all their uniqueness, in all their iterations through our lives, that is the starting place to inform, what is morally right and morally wrong. And so in that sense, I do believe that there are morally right and wrong things to do. And just very narrowly defined in that therapeutic encounter, I need to show up for my patients in a specific kind of deeply empathic way. Now, in terms of judging their, moral choices and belief system and all that, I think I'm not entirely agnostic to that, right? I mean, I think there are boundaries to deviance at the same time that those boundaries change over time, as culture changes and society changes. But I believe that they're underpinning all of that are still some basic fundamental things. And you and I have talked about this before, but I still think that there are just some deep truths about right and wrong that are universal and eternal, and essentially unchanging between and about human beings, that undergird all of our social mores, even as they're changing, even as we go astray and lose our way. So, I have a number of patients who have struggled with pedophilia, and I have deep empathy for them, at the same time that I'm working with them to move away from those behaviors, which we both agree are morally wrong.
So you said that our moral values might be culturally delimited in some sense, and they might change as culture changes, but there are also deeper moral truths that exist between humans. And I'm wondering, just for purposes of what I've been thinking about lately, whether you think that these also extend to animals. Because I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yes. I mean, I know I said it between humans, but yes, extend to living organisms, the planet. I do feel like that there are universal truths like physical laws. There are universal moral laws that are about being in harmony with the universe, and I think that extends to human behavior. And we are so small, and we can really only just approximate an understanding of that. But again, across religions, major philosophical traditions over centuries, we all kind of come to certain, universal truths that have to do with trying to love each other, trying not to hurt each other, trying to be good to people and animals and the world, beauty, recognizing and treasuring beauty. I mean, these are things that just are universal.
And do you find that ideally, so you're not doing psychoanalysis with your patients, which might involve 4 to 5 sessions a day for 5 to 8 years, who knows?
No,
So you're not
no.
going through this really complete, deep process.
Well, now, I like to think it's complete and deep, but it's not happening 4 sessions a week over many years. That's very true. It's not this, I mean, psychoanalysis is a very specific training that I've not had. It's a very specific way of practicing. Although, again, my sense is that we're all drawing on different traditions, and that even, trained psychoanalysts will draw from cognitive behavioral therapy, will draw from acceptance and commitment. I mean, you draw on what you need to in the moment.
Yeah, thanks for correcting me. But what I was wondering was if by the end of the process, assuming that you get to see the patient for as long as you would like to, because that's not always in your control, you want to guide them toward these universal values that you see, universal truths about morality, or if you consider the therapeutic process complete simply when they're happy and functional?
What I really work on, and what has become more important to me in my life and in my career, is practicing or trying to practice deep humility and appreciating that the more I know, the less I really know, and trying to be in awe of the process, and the mystery, and doing both, right? Trying to help people have a better, more fulfilling, more flourishing life, which I believe ultimately means living in harmony with these kinds of universal truths or universal morals. I do believe that, but I don't like hit people over the head with that. I just try to be a human being who's fully present and guiding them, to their own truths, while trying to also bring in this idea that, gee, we're not just like little atoms bouncing around in space with no relationship to other people or the world. We're all connected, and that has real relevance for what we consider to be the good.
Do you know the name Peter Singer?
Yes,
Yeah.
but not well, because I'm really sorry. I'm not. I'm a sort
Yeah.
of an armchair philosopher. I love it talking to philosophers, but I'm not steeped in that.
Right. I interviewed him, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks ago. It was really nice. We don't have the same views, but in certain ways we arrive at a similar position. But to speak very loosely, he's what's called a hedonistic utilitarianism, and he would say that, to use your vocabulary, the universal moral truth is that it is bad to contribute to the suffering of other life forms or creatures, or just suffering in general in the universe, and it is good to contribute to pleasure, something like that.
Sign me up.
So you're signed up for that.
Yep.
And he's one of maybe the world's most famous vegetarian.
Yes, I'm aware of that. Yeah.
I mean, we've gotten lunch so many times. I feel like I've seen you eat chicken.
Oh yeah.
At least, okay.
Yeah.
So you eat meat.
I do. Yes.
Okay. And it seems to me that, and I'm not trying to
No, it's all good. It's all good.
Okay, I'm not trying to corner you.
Right.
But if we have this obligation to be in harmony with the universe, with the earth, and with animals, and there are these deep moral truths, it seems like you have to acknowledge that it is wrong to eat meat.
So I don't know much about the world of animals and animal harm, and I mean, I sort of have a lay understanding of this, but I could very easily accept the premise that I am a hypocrite in eating meat, and also embracing this idea that we should do our best to contribute to, end suffering for all creatures, and that is also part of my philosophy, or my worldview, is that we're highly flawed creatures. We're all living hypocrites. There's no perfect human. There's no perfect life, and that even in trying our best, we will never meet the ideal. We can. I think awareness of that is really, really important. I haven't focused on the whole animal thing, but if I did, and educated myself, someone like Peter Singer, who's really focused on that, he's put a lot of effort into that. But it could be in his pursuit of wanting to be good to animal life, he has injured humans in some way. I don't know. What I'm just saying? Like, there's no perfect path, and so I think we sort of, with what we've been given, we can try to do good and to be good, knowing that we'll always fall short.
Yeah, I mean, this has been in the last 6 weeks or so well after our last lunch, but I've been eating much more closely to vegan. I've only been eating meat from deer that are culled for other reasons.
Okay.
But I know that you're a fan of Nietzsche. And
well, I'm not a fan, really.
Okay.
I'm not a fan. No. I mean, I would say I'm actually probably not a fan of Nietzsche. But I'm intrigued by him because of certain things I've been thinking about lately, and trying to understand what his core message is, which I think I still don't fully understand.
Yeah, nor do I. I'm again glad that you corrected me. You're interested in Nietzsche.
That's better. Yeah.
And I spoke to a professor who studies Nietzsche, a philosopher, obviously, and what I mentioned that I was thinking about being vegan, and he sort of just went like this and was very disappointed
Okay.
and said that he said a couple of things. One thing he said was that I should relish in the fact that we're superior dominant animals and can subjugate the animals we eat, and I should relish in their suffering for my benefit.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yes, I thought that was a very interesting thing to say, and I've
Yeah.
been
Is he a
thinking.
Nietzschean? Because that sort of
Yes,
sounds Nietzschean. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
and I've been thinking a lot about that since, and in the context of this conversation that I
Yeah.
knew we were going to have,
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could consider a patient to be healed if every time they're eating meat, they're thinking, I'm so glad that this pig was stuffed in a crate and
Right.
suffered, and I'm enjoying this more because of the suffering of the animal.
I would think that would be the opposite of what I would be trying to promote in my therapeutic practice. That's exactly the opposite.
Right, and I think that that's very interesting because I'm a moral anti-realist, which you know, so I don't think that there are these moral facts.
Yeah.
And this gets back to where I was starting from when I said that you're being presumptuous. I don't mean that in an
It's okay.
offensive
It's
way,
good.
but a
It's good.
presumptuous in the sense that you have this insight into moral facts about what is right and wrong. For me, the idea of relishing in the suffering of the pig that you're eating is odious only because it's contrary to my values. My values being, well, it makes me feel bad when animals are suffering. But I don't think that there's a moral fact of the matter.
Yeah, and I'm very disinclined to engage with you like in a debate on this because you will win. Because I don't spend my time sort of thinking about these things in terms of like philosophical categories or analytical, logical. That's not how my mind works. But I'm going to just say to you that I think the fact that you would feel uncomfortable eating meat and then getting pleasure from the animal's suffering, to me, the fact that that would bother you is again tied to what I would say is universal moral truths having to do with compassion and empathy and recognition of our interconnectedness. I think those are enduring true things, and the fact that it creates discomfort in you, is number one a good thing, and number two a universal truth. So that's what I would say.
Right. My simple knee-jerk
Yes.
response to that is we can make a much simpler or we can give a much simpler and more scientific explanation without having to posit sort of what I would call spooky moral facts by just appealing to my neurology and psychology. Because you have cases, just think of the shooter at UT Austin, I don't know when it was, 20, 30 years ago, where he had a tumor in his brain that resulted in this immense disregard for the lives of other people. And in fact, the polar opposite, where he just had to go out and kill them. And I think he killed his wife and his mother-in-law and his dog. And as opposed to positing some sixth sense where we can attune ourselves to these non-causal moral facts, though some people might think that they are causal, we can just say, okay, we're, for whatever reason, appealing to evolutionary biology or just culture, we feel this way about other animals naturally.
Yeah, I mean, just because we can have a neurobiological explanation for how we are and what we do, that doesn't preclude the possibility of there being these kind of universal moral truths, right? Because we have the machinery to enact them doesn't mean that they don't separately exist as some kind of reality.
Certainly.
Okay, and then also, again, I would just say that it's not necessarily appealing to some sort of spooky sixth sense. I mean, the fact that we can all agree that shooter was doing something morally reprehensible, in that given context. I mean, again, I don't. we're not like reinventing the wheel there. That's sort of, those notions have been around for a long time. And yes, you can use evolutionary biology. Well, it makes sense. We don't want to kill each other off. Then that would end the species. Sure. I mean, you can use some purely materialistic, naturalistic explanation for all of those things. And that doesn't necessarily, again, also preclude the possibility of there being these sort of, I don't know really what you call them, spooky, sixth sense, whatever it is. I don't think those things, maybe they're the same thing, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you entirely that none of what I've said precludes the possibility of these moral facts. But if the materialist, naturalist can account for our moral behavior without having to posit these moral facts, then the onus is on the moral realist who believes in these moral facts to give us a very convincing account of what they are and how we are attuned to them. But
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I understand where you're coming from.
And I'm not trying to press you into
a
debate.
No, it's all good. I mean, I think this gets into sort of the sort of hyper-rationalism that we've come to, in this day and age. We so value these sort of logical, rational, categorizations and analyses. But I think we need to leave room for just like intuition, emotion, gut sense. And I'm not sure we really need to go down that road where, okay, you have to give me a defense of these moral facts, blah, 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 the frame, blah, what about, 1,000 years ago they were killing babies and it was fine. Again, it's always going to be contextual, and maybe there will be variations in what's morally right and wrong over time, given the historical context, sure. But, in that context, I just feel like there are still these universal truths about, how people need and want to treat each other.
I think that this is a good place to pivot.
Okay.
Because
you and I are not going to agree on this.
Well, we're certainly not going to agree on this.
Yes.
But I would say that I think it's good, though, that philosophers, because there are plenty of moral realist philosophers like Peter Singer,
right,
who do think that there are these deep moral truths, and there are, of course, the anti-realists. And it's good, though, I think that they're getting into the weeds of these areas, because I'm not one of them.
Yeah.
But you said that there is a place for intuition and emotion and this sort of thing. And I wanted to ask about this in the context of therapy, because I think that if we went all the way down the line reductionistically and told me everything that's going on in my brain right now, it would not help me at all as far as the therapeutic process is concerned. You could tell me, oh, you have a dopamine imbalance and these things are firing wrong. But I would say, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? But in therapy, emotion and intuition maybe and stories we tell ourselves are much more important. And I'm wondering, because you're an MD, you're a psychiatrist, and psychiatrists are medically informed, how you balance these two, because intuition and emotion don't at first glance seem scientific in a sense.
Well, I mean, first of all, that's what makes the practice of psychiatry so interesting and challenging, that we're not excluding any of those schools of thought, right? Like, we use the neuroscience lens, we use the sort of relational psychotherapy lens. We're very focused on emotions and affect, that's paramount. And we do rely on our intuition. We have to rely on that, and it's very, very relational and in the moment, preserving that kind of psychological flexibility to respond to exactly what's happening here and now, incorporating, what we've talked about before. Absolutely, the narrative is really important. So, I mean, that's essentially my data, right? I collect narratives, right? And how people tell their stories is as important as, the content itself, right? Whether or not they see themselves as perpetually the victim or they're able to acknowledge what they've contributed to a problem. These are all kinds of things. But I would also say that the neuroscience, and sort of that framework can also be helpful to people, especially when they're engaging in very stigmatizing, behaviors that are irrational, like behaviors related to compulsive overconsumption, addiction, behaviors that take them outside of their own moral values. It can be helpful to understand notions of, for example, the hijacked reward pathway and the role of dopamine, how we mistake this substance or this behavior for something important for survival, what role dopamine played from an evolutionary perspective, prescribing medications, what we hypothesize we're doing to the brain when we prescribe these medications. It doesn't ever have to be one or the other.
Well, this might be a good time not to pivot, but to
Go back.
No,
Go back.
not to go back. Let's see, to take a detour just for a moment, because I know that you've been working on, and also, well, I think you've published this workbook.
Yeah.
Perhaps related to Dopamine Nation?
Yes. So it's the official Dopamine Nation Workbook. It's called the official Dopamine Nation Workbook because there are a bunch of fake Dopamine Nation workbooks that came out right after Dopamine Nation was published, which apparently is not illegal to do. And I had a lot of readers ask me for a workbook. So it's an interactive workbook using the ideas from Dopamine Nation.
Okay. Could you tell me more about what it is and how it works?
Yeah, so there's this acronym in Dopamine Nation, dopamine. It's basically a framework for how we try to intervene to help people mitigate compulsive, overconsumptive addictions like addiction to substances, addiction to food, behaviors like pornography, video games, social media, you name it. And it just sort of walks people through, like in an interactive way, how to prepare for a dopamine fast, what to expect, how to optimize success, what to do when the dopamine fast is over. So kind of simulating what a very specific intervention, clinical outpatient intervention would look like, but allowing them to do it either on their own or with their own therapist or counselor or teacher or parent or spouse or what have you.
And as you know from our many past conversations, one of the things that I've struggled with is binge eating.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how I might use the workbook for something like that. What are the protocols it would suggest, or how would I interact with the workbook in general?
Yeah, so binge eating or food addiction is more and more prevalent now, and it's not in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That is to say, food addiction is not. We have various types of eating disorders that are typically associated with various types of body dysmorphia, but really conceptualizing food as drugified and leading to compulsive overconsumption out of that person's agency or desire is a pretty new idea. And so this workbook conceptualizes ultra-processed food as a drug and essentially would walk somebody through that same sort of thing. So it would be, number one, data collection. So the D stands for data. What am I eating, how much and how often? So what are the foods that really you would tend to binge on? For most people, it's things like cookies, cake, ice cream, potato chips.
So what I'm thinking is
There
one of
you
the
go.
background
There you go.
tracks
All
right
the
now.
usual suspects. And it can be very nice and validating for people to know that, that is also what other people struggle with. Again, getting to this idea that the food itself is drugified. We don't tend to binge on broccoli, right? People with severe food addiction,
sometimes.
right? The compulsive behavior becomes sort of global, and then it's just eating till you're sick, even if it's broccoli, right? So, but that's typically end stage. It sort of starts with this very reinforcing food, which not only provide calories, but releases dopamine in the reward pathway. It's very clear that sugar, for example, lights up the nucleus accumbens, which is rich in dopamine-releasing neurons. So it would be you identifying that, becoming aware of it, identifying why you do that. So what are some of the emotional needs or goals that you're hoping to achieve, identifying problems associated with use, including, is it working for you? Because a lot of times drugs will work great initially and then stop working or even start to cause the opposite, or health problems, or if you're engaging in purging behavior, that can have a lot of health problems associated with it too. For example, vomiting or laxatives or what have you. And then kind of the whole focusing on a period of abstinence. And when it comes to a food addiction, obviously we're not recommending not eating. So it's using this sort of 3 concentric circles. The inner circle is, what are the types of foods I'm going to abstain from for 4 weeks? 4 weeks typically being the amount of time it takes to get out of that vortex of addiction and stop the constant cravings and feel better. So that would go into that inner circle. Then the middle circle is, what are the foods or behaviors that will trigger a desire to want to eat those foods? It could be watching YouTube videos of people eating those foods, right? Or advertisements for those foods, or going to a certain aisle in the grocery store where those foods are available. So that would be trying to avoid those triggers. And then that last circle is the approach behaviors. What are alternative things that you can do that are more healthy and adaptive to help cope with emotional distress, including the emotional distress of withdrawal. Because withdrawal from the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, including food, are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And what we try to really communicate to people is that when we first give up our drug of choice, all of that gets much worse, but it's not going to be forever. Once the brain begins to reset itself, and you get to about week 3 or 4 of abstaining, you start to feel better. You're not constantly thinking about using, your drug of choice. In your case, eating potato chips. It starts to really recede in the background. It gets easier and easier as time goes along. And that's true whether you're trying to give up cigarettes or cannabis or pornography or, whatever it is. So kind of walking through that process. And then, of course, what to do afterward, which is, okay, now that the dopamine fast is over and I'm feeling better, do I want to go back to eating potato chips? And if so, very specifically, what is that going to look like? When am I going to eat potato chips? With whom? In what circumstances? How much? How often? Was that the level of summary you were?
That was a wonderful summary.
Okay.
I mean, I can, just from knowing you and from hearing that and from reading Dopamine Nation, because I haven't read the official Dopamine Nation workbook.
It's not coming out till October.
Okay. Well, I know that I will be very confident suggesting to our listeners that they take a look at it. Something, though, that you said that I find very interesting is that food addiction is not in the DSM-V. And what this makes me wonder is how the DSM-V functions in your practice and how you balance it with your intuition about what a mental illness is.
Right.
And furthermore, if the DSM-V is at least ideally supposed to delimit just what the mental illnesses are, if it doesn't do that, then what exactly is a mental illness and why might it evade description?
Oh dear.
Huge questions.
Huge
questions.
Yeah. So first of all, let's just talk a little bit about how the DSM is made, right? It's frankly pseudoscientific. It's a bunch of so-called experts getting together around a table saying, we think this is a disorder and should go in the DSM, and then reviewing the available science, and then describing the disorder, and then creating criteria. So basically, it's a very imperfect process. Experts sitting around a table, sort of trying to say, is this a disorder? Coming to some sort of consensus. Many times, the experts invited around the table already have, preconceived notions about whether it is or is not. So really, it's about, is there sort of more global acceptance, momentum, will to make it something in the DSM. And then essentially you just end up with a bunch, I like to say it's just like a bunch of different buckets, right? And there's overlap in the symptomatology, but at the end of the day, there's no blood scan or brain test. There's no brain scan or blood test to diagnose any mental health disorder. It's based on what we call phenomenology. So these are patterns of behaviors that repeat themselves across individuals, time periods, demographics, temperaments, that just seem so characteristic of a kind of psychopathology, that is to say, a way of thinking, feeling, behaving that causes harm to self and others in a given time period, in a given society, such that we will label this person as in psychological distress, as having a mental illness. And then in our very medicalized modern society, we will then, once they're labeled as a patient, begin to try to treat them. So this is all deeply socioculturally contextual. The DSM is clearly going to be mainly just a shared language, not a deeply scientific kind of construct. And there's a lot to be criticized with it. When I personally think about mental illness, I think about, for me, the best framework is the stress vulnerability diathesis, which is to say, with enough stress, any of us could look crazy, right? So enough sleep deprivation, both you and I would be hallucinating and hearing voices and delusional, right? So essentially, that kind of moves around through time, where if you have somebody who with very little so-called stress can have those symptoms, we would tend to say they have a mental illness, or that it's manifest with very little stress. But in other circumstances, we would say, no, that person's not mentally ill, or maybe certain time periods. So for example, one thing that's always fascinated me about patients with bipolar disorder, and this is just an anecdotal personal observation, is that in times of severe stress in their lives, you'll never see anyone more calm. Like, they just rise to it. But when things are going better and that stress is off, there can be a very significant mental breakdown. So one of the ways that I think about that is, wow, no wonder bipolar disorder is endemic in the population. In times of great war or famine or what have you, those were probably, we needed those people, right, to be more stable. But now it's kind of a liability. Same thing with addiction. Like, I think of addiction, people who are willing to work harder, run faster, swim further to get scarce resources, were people who you absolutely needed to keep the whole tribe alive, right? But now people who are willing to do that, put all that extra work in to get certain rewards in this world of overwhelming overabundance, that turns into a liability.
And a question I have is, if still the DSM-V is sort of the official delineation of what a mental illness is, if another psychiatrist says, my patient so-and-so has a mental illness, it is not covered in the DSM-V, does that supersede the DSM-V if there is some mythical psychiatric body where you all vote on whether or not something is a mental illness? Will you accept the psychiatrist's word that the patient has a mental illness, or will you fall back on the DSM-V and say, and overrule the psychiatrist's judgment?
You put a patient into a room with 10 different psychiatrists, you can get 10 different diagnoses. So these are very subjective types of interpretations, and psychiatrists can and do disagree. When it comes to getting reimbursed by third-party payers, it pretty much has to be a DSM diagnosis.
Very interesting.
And some insurers will cover some diagnoses and not others. So you have to have a sort of mind to that too, because if your patient meets threshold criteria for a certain diagnosis, even if that's not maybe what you think the work has to focus on, you might use that because otherwise they can't get help, right? They can't bill their insurance. So there are so many different factors that go into it. Getting back to food addiction, which is not yet in the DSM, but there's a movement now to get it into the DSM. I can't diagnose food addiction because it doesn't come up on the medical records, right? It's not in there because it's not in the DSM, and insurers won't pay for it. But generally speaking, that's probably the focus of my treatment, using the addiction lens to target the disordered eating rather than using a body dysmorphia, eating disorder lens, which maybe hasn't worked before, hasn't helped that person. So a lot of factors go into that.
you put a patient in a room with 10 psychiatrists
Yeah.
and you get
Oh, I see. You're stuck on that. You went back to it.
I'm stuck on that because I think it should be intuitively troubling that this is what happens with if you give a patient to doctors who hold this very important place in our society, and we go to them for our biggest problems with our health, which are our health problems, and if we get 10 different answers that suggest that there is a startling lack of consistency
Oh yeah.
within
I mean, we just have to admit that it's not exactly science that we're
right. So
doing.
that's where I was going. I mean, just what is the relationship then between psychiatry, psychiatric training, and science?
There's not no relationship. We're learning more all the time. I really don't want people to discount phenomenology. Phenomenology is recognizable, indisputable patterns of behavior that repeat themselves across individuals, temperaments, time periods, cultures. You look at any culture, in across the world now, and you can find something resembling schizophrenia, right? People who hear voices, who see things that other people don't see, who have thoughts that other people find inconsistent with reality. Now, in different cultures across times, people have interpreted that very differently. In some cultures, those are shamans. But at the end of the day, in most cultures, and by the way, schizophrenia is pretty rare. It's like 1% of the population, and that's pretty stable across different cultures. But it's a real thing, right? It's not a made up thing. Same thing with addiction, right? I mean, when we take the extreme of addiction, people who will consume alcohol until they die, despite wanting to stop and despite even acknowledging and seeing the harm and wanting to stop and not being, we can all agree that that's a form of psychopathology. That's real, right? We can hang our hat on that. We have a deep empathy. That's a concern. Family members, society more broadly. We need to help this person. What's going on? So it begins with the phenomenology. That's the right place where it should begin. And we're only just now beginning to try to understand, well, what is actually happening in the brain? What can we actually do about it? So again, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is a big movement now to kind of get rid of the DSM and focus just on specific symptomatology and trying to tie that to, what we know about the brain and the brain works. And that's probably a good thing. Ultimately, these paradigms all need to be wiped out in favor of new, better paradigms. But we don't need to throw the whole thing out. And also, let me just say, going back to the room of 10 psychiatrists and 10 different diagnoses for a single patient, there is that much disagreement when we have unusual or borderline cases or complex mixed cases, or we have a paradigm that's not working. My claim being that for many people with disordered eating, the eating disorder diagnostic paradigm is not as helpful as we would hope. And so we're shifting to this lens of food addiction, which we're feeling like can be more helpful for some patients, right? But for like really classic types of psychopathology, a patient that, you put them in a room with 10 psychiatrists, and 10 psychiatrists might really all agree on the diagnosis. So it's just sort of acknowledging and staying humble in the face of how much we still don't understand.
Speaking of the the phenomenology of schizophrenia, my mom, as you know, is a psychiatrist in Chicago. She works with largely, I think, homeless populations, or if not homeless populations, people with very little funds. And this is the thing you do as a psychiatrist child, is when you're roaming the streets, you point at people and you ask your mother what sort of illness they have. And when I was at Columbia, I was riding the subway with my mom, and there are lots of characters on the subway, and I wouldn't literally point at people, but I would ask what disorders she thought people have. And I noticed a trend where if people were wearing lots and lots of clothing in the summer, she could identify them as likely schizophrenics, because apparently schizophrenics are dissociated from their bodies in a way that we are not, and they may experience pain or temperature very differently than we do. And she told me this story about how, I think it was in the 1980s, there was a major heat wave in Chicago, and they went around to the homeless encampments and were handing out pairs of shorts, telling them, okay, wear these shorts, it's going to be 100 plus degrees. And at the end of this heat wave, a number of my mom's patients were found dead with wearing like 10 layers of clothing with the shorts on top of them.
Right, yeah.
And it's just kind of mind-blowing. But my point just being beyond the obvious interest of that story is that, yeah, there's clearly a phenomenology that is continuous across populations.
And yet, no disrespect to your mom. She was probably, trying to, respond to your curiosity, which is great. But one of the things that I try hard not to do is I try hard not to diagnose anybody who's not actually my patient. Again, this gets a little bit into the whole mind reading thing. Plus, when you don't know the broader circumstances of somebody's life, it's just really hard to know what their deal is, right? No matter their appearance.
Yeah.
Having said that, yes, I mean, I remember in my training there were certain telltale signs, if somebody's often if they were wearing headphones and a hat, it was sort of thought, are they trying to tune out auditory hallucinations? Or if they're going to be responding to internal stimuli, if they have headphones on, it looks less odd. Now it's, in the olden days before the internet and AirPods, walking down the street, it was easier to tell who was responding to internal voices. Now you can't really differentiate because people are talking to other people, all the time, other people who are not actually there through the internet.
Mm-hmm. I think this difference between you and my mom points to a spectrum in psychiatric practices that non-psychiatrists probably are not aware of. At one end, you have my therapist, who's a psychoanalyst, who's in his 80s, and at the beginning of his training, the psychoanalyst didn't even speak. You might hear a few words from the psychoanalyst every week. They were just listening to you talk. And he never consults the DSM-V, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, you have my mom, who does no talk therapy whatsoever. She just does medication management. And I can see that if you only have a few minutes with a patient, or you're doing rounds in a hospital, you have to make snap judgments about, especially when insurance doesn't want to pay for lengthy visits with these people, about what sort of illness they have. But in my mom's defense, I don't think that she was diagnosing them. She was responding to my nagging and just giving a ballpark estimate.
Totally. Yes. Yeah. And it is true that, that gestalt of somebody, just their appearance, how they walk, how they move. Yes, all of us do that all the time, and we do it with lightning speed. And in psychiatry, we do that too, but then we have to second guess those things as well. It's sort of like we really have to look under the hood and look deeper. At least I think so. We have that initial reaction, oh, this person, this is, what's going on. But then we have to not assume that we have it right, and we have to explore.
Speaking of these sort of, you mentioned headphones, hat. I'm just curious if you've noticed anything, or if you're paying attention to people's speech patterns and what that might tell you about their internal lives.
Absolutely. So there's, we do something called the mental status exam. And part of the mental status exam is not just the content of speech, but it's the form of speech, because the form of speech also represents the form of thoughts. And so that the way people speak and how they describe themselves and their experience, is very important. I mean, so examples would be things like tangential speech, right, where I ask a question or they're just telling a story and then they get sidetracked, way sidetracked, right? So that can be evidence of kind of a disorganized thought. Somebody who's very concrete and not really able to use simile or metaphor or kind of a more, let's say, symbolic representation. That's often, something that happens with things like schizophrenia. So we're always looking for those types of things.
Something funny that happened to me recently is I mentioned Riverside, this program I typically use to record my virtual podcast. They're constantly adding new features. One startling new feature is that because of all of the many, probably hundreds of hours of recordings of me that exist in their database, they can generate my voice and speech patterns.
Nice.
And they market this as, okay, say you don't want to do your ad reads, you can just type in the ad read and it'll generate it for you in a few seconds, and it sounds exactly like me and it mirrors my speech pattern. So
Wow.
I gave it some things to say just to test it out, and nobody could tell that it wasn't me.
Wow.
But what struck out at
incredible.
me is that the AI version of me paused at very strange places when speaking, and nobody noticed this. But it sounded very weird to me. And then in the past 2 weeks or so, two of my friends have told me, without being prompted, that I pause at extremely unexpected places in my sentences.
Interesting.
And I'm wondering if that's something that you had ever noticed about my speech patterns.
What I've noticed about your speech patterns is that you don't use many speech fillers like and which is unusual for people your age. A lot of people use speech fillers. I tend to use a speech filler, try not to do it, but do it. And so it's unusual when people can speak without speech fillers, and I think it's good. You have a sort of a pacing, which is sort of like a freight train. It's sort of you don't really modulate too much. You place one word after another in a kind of a steady stream. You are very careful about your choice of words, as I would expect from a philosopher, who's wanting to define first principles and terms and go out from there. I haven't noticed the unusual pauses, but I have noticed a bit of like a pressure to be inclusive, which I sometimes associated with OCD, like not a relaxed way of being able to not finish, but a kind of a pressure to have to finish the thought or finish the argument because your mind is still latched onto it. That's what I've noticed.
Yeah.
Because we're being totally frank here. What have you noticed about my speech?
Well, interesting, I have been diagnosed with OCD.
Okay.
The things I've been diagnosed with are
you going to just like tell the whole world what you've been diagnosed with?
Yeah, I
Why
guess.
not?
Well,
Why not?
I don't see. I asked my analyst is in academia.
Okay.
And I will occasionally ask him for advice about certain things, and I've asked him if I could talk about being in therapy.
Yeah.
On the podcast, and he suggested that I do not do it.
Okay.
Because it's still very much stigmatized in academia, which is where I intend to spend the foreseeable future. But when I clarified that I'm not really trying to frame myself as, for lack of a better word, a crazy, extremely troubled, insane person, but I think therapy is very important, and for that reason I think it's important to be honest and talk about my experience.
Yeah.
I don't think it's bad. No, but I've been diagnosed with depression and OCD and various eating disorders, all of which resonate with me. But I forget why. Oh, you asked me what speech patterns I've picked up with you. One, I noticed that you use your hands a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm also just very impressed with how comfortable you are on a camera.
Oh, okay.
And I'm also, I mean, this isn't so much a speech pattern thing, but you're a very good and active and curious listener. Which is good. But
Thank you.
the hands I notice a lot. The hands I notice a lot just because this is the first we've got 3 cameras, and I noticed that this is not bad at all. But I
Okay.
noticed that your hand is going in front of that
Oh,
camera.
shoot.
No, it's not a
Okay.
problem at all because
Yeah.
when you're talking, this camera's on you,
Yeah, got it.
and it's not on me.
Got
But
it. And
I still can't help but
unfortunately,
notice it.
I'm not waving my hands when you're talking.
Yes.
Right. So that's good.
Yeah. But I'd like to thank you. I mean, we all like to hear about ourselves, so it's interesting to hear the speech patterns that you pick up on. I just did this AMA, and somebody asked about speech patterns, and I talked about mine. One filler that I do use all the time is so.
Oh, okay.
And I try very hard, or
Yeah.
I'm trying very hard not to use it, but my dad is constantly pointing out when I use filler words
Yeah.
and when I mispronounce words.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I like, but it's something that sticks with me.
Well, I would say in general, you don't use a lot of filler words. I think the big one now that I hear so often, in the media, with various people and my own children, is just the repetitive use of the word like. It's really, I think it's just sort of gone too far. I wish young folks would work on that.
Mm-hmm. Returning though to science and psychiatry and intuition and emotion, what?
Science and psychiatry, okay.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask where medication fits into your practice,
Yeah.
and where you prefer to use. I mean, I don't know. Would medication be considered an invasive therapy, or?
I mean, it probably depends which medication. Every medication has potential side effects. So I think we should always proceed with caution. Patients should always have what's called informed consent, which is that they should be informed of the risk, benefits, and alternatives of any medication that they take. If I have a patient who starts having a physical or psychiatric symptom after I start a medication, I just simply presume that it's related to the medication until proven otherwise. I teach my residents not to dismiss these. I teach my trainees that, even if you've never heard of a medication causing a particular side effect before in your life and you've never read a case report and you've never seen it in the literature, still don't dismiss it, because in that person's body, that medication may actually be having that side effect. So again, coming back to let's stay humble. I have even said to patients, when I am prescribing medication, that this is not science that we're doing here. We're basically going through a process of trial and error, unfortunately, and just kind of seeing what works and what doesn't. That's how these medications were originally discovered, right? Many of our early medications were given for, other things like infectious diseases, and then found to elevate mood. And then retroactively, we made up, the monoamine hypothesis about what might be happening in depression that then, led to using those medications to treat a certain disorder. So it's really, it's not that I want to say it's not at all scientific, but it's really more trial and error than anything else. Now, having said that, these medications can absolutely be life-saving for some individuals, but I do think that they're often overprescribed, and they're often prescribed with the presumption of it being highly scientific and highly evidence-based, which it's just simply not.
I'm curious from a higher level whether you are preferring, though, in all cases, to use non-medicative interventions, because I mean, you and I have spoken off the air a lot about free will, and Robert Sapolsky in particular. And I think that this also connects to something we were discussing earlier, which is the sort of hesitancy to point out at the wrong time somebody's problems or their errors, because you want them to come to them themselves, ideally maybe, just because it can be injurious or maybe infringe upon their autonomy if you're pointing it out. And I imagine that as part of the therapeutic process, you want to train your patients to be able to solve their problems on their own, and you want to instill in them a strong sense of self-esteem. And I just think inherently it undermines self-esteem to feel that one needs medication to cope with their problems. I'm medicated. I'm on like 20 milligrams of Prozac or something, 15. So it's not huge. I've gone down, but I know that I would feel better about myself if I weren't on it at all.
Yeah, so I don't really like that rigid construction that you just implied, and I don't come to it with that. Again, I think I try to come to it with a real stance of humility, like we don't really know what's happening in the brain. People's suffering is multifactorial. The biopsychosocial spiritual model, I think, very well describes mental illness. There are biological aspects, psychological aspects, social, contextual, and spiritual aspects to it. And that we just have to sort of stay humble and try all the tools. For some people, medications really are going to be the best answer and won't, for them personally, undermine self-esteem or a sense of autonomy or agency. For others, that would be a very difficult barrier to embrace the idea of medication, even when that might be the best for them. For some people, that's the first thing they want is a pill, right? And sort of try to encourage them to explore other options. So I think it's good to just stay flexible, to sort of meet people where they are, to recognize that people come from so many different backgrounds, life experiences, concepts of the world, and really just kind of practically speaking, what works, without we just don't know enough, It's sort of like, who am I to judge?
No, thank you for stressing, and I think it's interesting that there's this very pragmatic, individual-centered approach to therapy, and my sort of rigid thinking about it is a product of my projecting my own psychology onto all other patients, which...
Well, thank you for receiving that in such a kind of...
No, I'm wrong all the time.
Yeah, it's good that we can own that. But getting back to, the earlier part of our discussion, what's so interesting is that, what did you call yourself, an anti-moral realist? Is that what it was?
Anti-realist.
An anti-realist.
Moral anti-realist.
Yeah, so what's interesting to me is that although you identify yourself as a moral anti-realist, you come to things like psychiatry and medication, psychotherapy, with what I perceive as kind of strong and somewhat rigid moral notions. Which is funny because I'm supposedly the sort of moral realist, and yet I feel like I'm not so, I'm a more open, maybe I guess I'm kind of congratulating myself, but...
Yeah, yeah. What are the morally rigid notions that you think I'm
Well,
espousing?
just right now, this sort of idea that you had that, I would think that taking medication sort of undermines self-esteem or agency or confidence.
Well, I don't think that that's a moral notion.
Mm-hmm.
It might be, I might be making an assertion about psychology, but that's not a moral thing.
Okay.
And that I can totally be wrong about.
Okay.
As you illustrated with, because you're the one with experience and expertise in this area, which I'm not. One other thing I wanted to ask about, and clearly this is going to be something that is different between patients, but for me, having creative pursuits is important for my self-understanding and self-development. And I'm wondering to what extent that functions in your practice.
Oh yeah, it's huge. It's pretty far along in terms of advanced coping strategies, so it's something that we often get to later in treatment.
What do you mean by it's an advanced coping strategy?
I mean that to truly be creative means to be able to tolerate quite a lot of distress, to sit with yourself in the quiet, to see what emerges, to validate self and one's own ideas and think that they're worthy of putting out into the world. people who come into treatment, and I would say people generally, struggle with these things, right? We tend to invalidate ourselves. We tend not to be confident in our own voice. We tend to, especially in this day and age, not be able to tolerate sitting in the quiet with our own thoughts. We're constantly distracting ourselves, and there are so many ways to do that now. So it's quite counterculture, plus just difficult to be able to sort of be creative today. So it's something that people come to typically later, but very, very important. And I always like to emphasize, like, it doesn't have to be like some huge accomplishment, right? I mean, there's creativity in everyday tasks and how you fold the laundry, right? Creativity. I had a patient of mine who discovered golf ball art, and part of his process was finding, stray golf balls and then putting them together to make these little animals. I mean, and it brought him, no end of delight and joy, and they would give them away as little gifts. And what's so important with that process is that we are involved in the process of creation, which I think is just like a fundamental human need. Getting back to these universal truths, right? We want to be engaged in that process of creation.
Something that is unclear to me about the terminology of it referring to the creative process as an advanced coping strategy is it's unclear because coping to me has a negative connotation.
Oh, okay.
You don't, if you're coping with something, maybe you're not dealing with it head on, you're trying to cover it up.
Okay.
And what I was asking about, or what I had in mind, was how you might use creativity as a tool for self-exploration and the advancement of the therapeutic process, but it seems like you're referring to it as something, and maybe that's difficult to do, as you said, in this day and age, but it's something that obscures a problem rather than illuminates it.
So I think of coping as something that we all need to do with the human condition, and that you have maladaptive coping and then you have adaptive coping. And we often talk to patients about learning adaptive coping skills to replace maladaptive coping skills. So for me, coping itself as a term doesn't have negative connotations. It's just sort of a given that we need to cope. There are good ways to do that and some not so good ways to do that. In terms of sort of creativity as part of self-exploration and the creative process as part of the healing process, yes, I think that's also important. Although what I think is interesting about the creative process is that it's not, to me, it's not a purely introspective process. It's really an opening up kind of process where we are receiving as much as we're giving. So, and I think that's a key part of it, right? It's not just like this kind of solipsistic, like I'm in my creative. It's really kind of a way of being in the world and in the moment, experiencing a flow that is interactive. And so for me, it's an opening.
Well, I can think, I mean, now that the word coping has come into the conversation, I can think of ways in which coping and exploration both have functioned in my own creative practices. I mean, one of the books of mine that you read was a love story to some extent, and I definitely wrote that at a time in which I was very romantically lonely. And this was an escapist way of coping with my own loneliness. But then other stories that I've written, and one that immediately comes to mind, involves a character at war where people all around him are being brutally murdered, civilians are being raped, this sort of thing, and some of the people in his squad are raping somebody, and he stops this because he feels obligated to do so morally, but he's at the same time confronted with the fact that, okay, say he saved one person from being raped, there are thousands of people being raped maybe at that very moment, and he's confronted with this nihilistic impulse. What does it matter that I saved one person? But for me, that is very self-exploratory because even in the present, even though I wrote that many years ago, I'm in the present confronted with this dichotomy where on the one hand there's this nihilistic impulse, we're atoms in the void, but then on the other hand I'm so constituted as to feel immense suffering when I know that I'm eating animals who are suffering. And that just runs contrary to the nihilistic impulse. So I'm exploring that in the literature, and that's very important for my own growth. So I see it functioning in both ways.
Yeah, nice. So you're using your own writing as a framework to explore some of the deep emotional and, dare I say, moral challenges that you're feeling in your own life.
Right, but it's not conscious. It's something that comes out after the fact.
Okay, yeah, nice.
I often will discuss this in therapy.
Nice.
Things that I'm writing will come up, and we can maybe tease out.
Right. Well, that is wonderful, right? Because essentially you are doing a kind of a working through at maybe an unconscious level through your creative work, and that's what's so great about creative pursuits is that they are working on these multiple different levels, and in the creative process we come to an idea, or we have a thought, or we have an imagination, and it's almost as if we couldn't have engineered it, right? It's just sort of part of that process, and I think that's what makes us feel alive too.
And when you're dealing with your patients, though, do you ever encourage them to pick up creative processes for this exploratory rather than coping purpose?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So that's part of healthy and adaptive coping, is thinking about, what are some creative interests or creative pursuits, and a lot of times people will say, well, I'm not creative, or I don't have any interest, or that's part of the problem. I don't have any hobbies. I don't know what I like. I don't know what I'm interested in. And so really helping them kind of connect with themselves, really, in a more fundamental way, by identifying much of what they do that feels like it emerges from their authentic selves as creative, right? It doesn't just have to be like this, I collect these things, or I draw, or I make music. I mean, you can make music in a way that's very uncreative, right? That's very mechanistic and very sort of rule-based and performative. Okay, so how can you feel that connection, right? That where you're feeling that you're real and in your body and really alive and in the moment, not experiencing FOMO, all of those things.
It's interesting. So I play the drums, and for me, the drums are not creative at all, but they're still very helpful therapeutically. What I do is every day I sit down for 30 minutes or so, and for maybe the first 15 or 20 minutes, I just pick a rudiment. So there are 40 international drum rudiments. One is a paradiddle, for instance. And I'll just do that for 20 minutes or so. And the reason it's so therapeutic for me is that for these 20 minutes, I really don't have to worry about philosophy or the podcast or fiction writing or working out. And I can just focus on this very narrow area in my life where it's somewhat easy to make improvements, and I think it just gives me a sense of control.
Yeah, right. And so that's essentially not dissimilar to what people experience in meditation or with paced breathing or certain forms of exercise. It's a way to kind of clear the mind, to quiet the mind, which you can achieve either through focusing very deeply on one thing with a still body, or focusing on the body itself and certain types of movement, or chanting. These are all ways to sort of quiet the mind, still the mind, essentially it's interesting that you say, control, because I think probably what's happening is you're probably quieting the prefrontal cortex in that instance, and really focusing on more primitive basic movement and rhythm. And so giving your prefrontal cortex, or those control areas, a break.
Mm-hmm. And on the opposite side of the creative process, do you find yourself ever encouraging patients to explore like the consumption of artistic media for therapeutic benefits?
Oh, absolutely, and for non-therapeutic benefits, right? Because, I mean, the experience of art and the experience of awe, those are all so important. Again, for feeling connected to the universe, to other people, to getting a sense of meaning and purpose. But on the other hand, the bigger challenge now is that there are so many digital media that are available for ready consumption and that are incredibly alluring, that more often the problem is that we're in a constant consumptive mode, and we're not really pausing that constant reaction to external stimuli, to quiet the mind, to see what's happening in the mind without constant external stimulation, and furthermore, to be generative, right, and see what's coming up ourselves. We're running away from that, right? We don't want to listen to the parroting thoughts like, I'm a piece of crap, I'm a piece of crap, I'm a piece of crap, right? So we're running away to try to, or whatever, whatever those ruminations may be.
Mm-hmm. Two things that come out of this. One that I think maybe you'll object to, maybe you won't, maybe you'll say that in some cases this is the case. You mentioned when talking about creativity that it's nice for a patient to see something authentic emerge out of themselves when they're in this creative practice. And I think that gets back maybe to something that I was saying earlier about how part of the therapeutic process involves fostering the patient's sense of autonomy and control.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, another important part of therapy is this relationship between the patient and the provider, and one of the roles of this is facilitating the patient's assimilation into a community outside of this room. And for me, part of consuming art is connecting with an artist, even if that person is long dead. But I recall in high school, there was an Edvard Munch exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I went there, and there's at the front of the entryway to the exhibit, there's this self-portrait of Edvard Munch, and he's very shadowy with the black backdrop, and he's just smoking a cigarette and kind of fading in a way into the painting. And at the time, being a very dramatic 15 or 16-year-old, this very much resonated with me, and I think helped me in a certain way at that time period. And that's one way in which art might help somebody who is feeling isolated.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I agree with everything. I wouldn't disagree with anything you just said. That all makes sense to me.
Okay. Well, perfect. Then on that note, we should just finish this while we're up. Anna, thank you so much for taking the time to be my guinea pig again. I could not be happier with how this turned out. It was so much more fun doing it in person too.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's always a joy to talk with you. I always learn.
Yeah, and I think we have a lunch date in a couple of weeks,
Yeah,
so
sounds good.
you'll get a double dose.
Yeah.
Okay.